Delight to have Marc here on campus for so many days. He gave a wonderful talk last night as well, and today's talk promises to be equally illuminating. So let me just briefly and informally say a few words about Marc and his work before I turn things over to him. Marc is a Yiddishist and a comparatist who has a degree from NYU in comparative literature. He has taught at a number of institutions: Johns Hopkins, Indiana University, University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, and now I would actually add the University of Minnesota, since Marc just led a wonderful session, or really a mini session with my class on this story that is the subject of today's talk. Some of the students in the class who are here as well have read the story, and so you can add that to your list. And also his own alma mater, Yale University. So Marc has also written many, many articles that range in topics, all of them coming back to this intersection between Yiddish literature and other literary contexts, national contexts, and always with great imagination, I would add. So his most recent book, which came out in 2011 with Stanford University Press, How Strange the Change Language, Temporality, and Narrative Form in Peripheral Modernisms. And we do have it in the library, so I'm happy to say that everybody can, after Marc departs the Twin Cities, where he has experienced the joys of Minnesota in April in a snowstorm, and everything else, his work will continue here. So his talk today with us is entitled Yiddish Exceptionalism, Lynching, Race, and Racism in Joseph Opatoshu's American Fiction. Marc. So Marc's going to speak for about 35-40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for what I'm sure will be a very lively discussion.
Well, I want to begin, first of all, in Yiddish we say, before I begin, I'd like to say a few words. I'd like to begin first and foremost by thanking Leslie Morris for this generous, magnificent invitation to spend time with you on campus. This has really been the highlight of my school year, and I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to share my work with you and with so many parts of the Twin Cities community. I want to thank Meyer Weinschel for being such a great shaliach and accompanist around campus and making sure that I neither get lost nor fall into a snowdrift. I can't tell you, for a person such as myself, not from a snow-bearing climate and not being very tall, how very much a service that he has performed. And I want to thank you all for coming today. As Professor Morris said, I'm going to try to speak for about 40 minutes, and I want those of you who have the time to stick around, maybe to open it up to questions, to comments, to conversation, because I think that that's really fundamental to the way that knowledge is created and distributed. I'll tell you a little bit about how I came to write about this. The origins of this article began many, many years ago. I was spending some time at the University of Michigan, which I don't know, is it in your school charter that you're supposed to hate them? Or, you know, I was spending some time in Ann Arbor, and a friend of mine there came up to me and he said, you know, we're putting together a conference about the writer Joseph Opatoshu, and we wanted to know, maybe would you like to contribute to it? And I said no, I don't work on American Yiddish literature. And if I did work on American Yiddish literature, I wouldn't work on Joseph Opatoshu. It's not for me. I wouldn't have anything to say. He said, well, that's really too bad, because, you know, there's an all-expense-paid trip to Germany to do it. I said, oh, well, I got a good one. Yeah, no problem. I'll be right in. So that's how I came to read this story, to write about this story, and really to discover something about this author, Joseph Opatoshu, that was not only very, very interesting in my opinion, but also very distinctive to what American Yiddish literature talked about and what it was able to do and what it tried to do. And when I conceived of this article a few years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, I thought that I was contributing to my portfolio about literary history. But events have overtaken my own writing on the subject to indicate that what I was actually writing about in an unforeseen and really unfortunate way, is current events. The relevance of this story to what's happening now is both uncanny and extremely upsetting. But I think it's important to go back to the principles that Opatoshu is talking about in order to see not only, well, you know, where did we get to, how did we get here, but also maybe some of the alternatives that we need to affirm in order to go forward. Before we talk about Opatoshu, I'd like to start by considering a poem by Opatoshu's contemporary Aleph Leilis, one of the really great, innovative Yiddish poets working in New York City during the 1920s and the 1930s. In 1926, Leilis wrote a poem called In Subway, In the Subway. And in the third of its 4 sections, the poem takes an unexpected turn when the speaker imagines himself an African-American man in a subway car pressing against a white female passenger. As a pristine example of high modernist aesthetics, the uneasy juxtaposition of a black man and a white woman, apparent strangers, represents the danger and desire of accidental, disorienting encounters in the modern city, as well as the internal logic of a poetic strategy that produces meaning out of unexpected and incongruous combinations of words and sounds. The poem's rapid, almost rapping rhymes are as significant as the image of urban dystopia it depicts, and the effect of the whole reiterates the initiatory paradox of an American poet writing in Yiddish and a Yiddish poet writing about the American metropolis. These avant-garde strategies venture into the phantasmagoric when the author writes, a weiß Mädel und ein Neger, treuer in dem rierendicken, greuen Mäuer, treuer von einem Jäger, was weiß, als kann seinen gegarzten Fang nicht kriegen, nicht hinten auf die Rälsen redeln Räder, wirbeln, schwindeln, drehen, in einem schwarzen, kreiseldicken, unglücklichen Kopf, Lynching, flacker, schleifer, fliehen, steifer, der Neger drückt sich starker zu dem Mädel. A white girl and a Negro, sorrow in the turning gray wall. Sorrow from the hunter who knows that he cannot capture his sought-for prey. Not under the wheels that turn. The wheels turn. They make him dizzy. They turn in the black, curly, unfortunate head. The fires of lynching flicker and flicker. The knot of the hangman's noose tighter and tighter. The Negro turns more violently to the girl. In this image, the turning subway wheels generate a vertigo through which the man's desire for the woman transforms him from the pursuer to the pursued, and the heat generated by people in claustrophobic proximity becomes the flames consuming the man's body as punishment for a sexual crime still only imagined. Although the entire purpose of this portrayal of sexualized racial taboo is to shock the reader, it is nonetheless unsurprising that Leilis makes reference to lynching. Lynching is a recurring theme in American Yiddish poetry. Perhaps the most complicated, provocative, and problematic depiction of this issue in Yiddish literature, however, can be found in Yosef Opatoshu's long story Lyncherei, Lynching, first published in book form in Warsaw in 1923, although Opatoshu by this time had been living in the United States for over 15 years. Indeed, Lyncherei is the only extended narrative in the collection in which it first appears, but it introduces a series of much shorter vignettes, presumably appearing originally in Der Tag, a New York Yiddish daily to which Opatoshu was a lifelong contributor, dramatizing other aspects of what would now be termed American multiculturalism, race and racism, anti-Semitism, intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews, and the plight of non-Jewish immigrants from Russia, Poland, Italy, and China, among other themes. It is safe to contend that no other Yiddish writer offers a more graphic examination of racist violence toward African Americans than Opatoshu does in the 35 or so pages of this story. Its central action is the pursuit and lynching of a young African American man, Booker. One wonders if this might be a mistaken rendering of the name Booker. In short episodes, the story progresses from the perspective of Booker's grandfather, Jim. The association of his name with the African-American protagonist of Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn is irresistible, and turns from the grandfather to Booker's mother and siblings, and also the sheriff of Burke, Georgia, as well as the white townspeople who anticipate the lynching. The lynch mob leader, McClure, figures, and it is McClure's daughter who has apparently been violated by Booker that provokes the lynching, though this is, in turn, retaliation for McClure himself having violated Booker's sister. And eventually, the story depicts Booker's own flight, capture, and tortuous execution by the lynch mob. The panoramic perspective of this story provides a focused and urgent example of Opatoshu's lifelong commitment to an aesthetic of literary realism, a practice that in its broadest dimensions serves to illustrate, valorize, and critique the processes by which a society rationalizes and modernizes itself. Like the great novelists of 19th century European literature, Opatoshu uses literature to hold a mirror up to a society as a synthetic and synchronic whole. The problem, however, for Yiddish literature in America, a problem that makes this belated investment in realism provocative and useful for an understanding of realism in general, is determining to what extent a writer such as Opatoshu can effectively represent his adopted nation in Yiddish, when one of the few universal traits of American public life, in his day as at present, was the monolingual monopoly of the English language on public life. As the ensuing discussion will argue, Opatoshu's artistic shortcomings in this instance enable the story he narrates to provide an invaluable, if complicated, insight into the sociology of racism. The use of realist narrative strategies in a Yiddish story about lynching captures the contradictions of American racism because the story's very existence is, in a sense, contradictory. In a 1954 essay at the end of his life, Opatoshu offers his assessment of Yiddish culture in America over the preceding 6 decades, starting with the early Yiddish poets of the first immigrants to the United States and the first issue of the journal Die Zukunft, The Future, and concluding with perhaps surprising optimism about the continued vitality of Yiddish in America after the Holocaust. 2 comments from the essay are especially relevant for assessing Opatoshu's own writing, which he nowhere mentions in his remarks, and its approach to American themes. Of America itself, Opatoshu writes, quote, "There is a rhythm in America that is alien to Europe, not the external rhythm that is only skin deep, but the inner rhythm that comes from getting to be at home in the country with the average American, of whom 1 out of 2 traces his ancestry back to 4 or 5 different peoples." End quote. On the location of Yiddish in the United States, he writes by contrast, quote, "Yiddish literature in the United States, though far from its source of origin, assumed an artistic form in many respects superior to the work of the first masters, reminding one that the greatest Polish works of Mickiewicz and Słowacki were written not in Poland, but in France and in Switzerland." These observations crystallize the general argument of the essay. that one of the challenges to writing in Yiddish in the United States is the multicultural mix of dynamism and danger that characterizes American society and distinguishes it from the ostensibly homogeneous culture of Eastern European Jewry with which Yiddish writers continue to identify their ethnic origins. Even when writing on American subjects, Yiddish literature thus remains the work of an exiled and peripheral culture. For the American Yiddish writer, consequently, the natural habitat for Yiddish culture and the primary measurement of cultural authenticity is to be found for the American Yiddishist, like the Polish nationalist in exile, not where he or she is, but where he or she is from. Given both the enormity of Opatoshu's output, as well as the intellectual curiosity that motivates the entirety of his career, it should nonetheless come as no surprise that writing about America in Yiddish motivates some of the author's most interesting and innovative fiction. To an equal degree, however, it should come as no surprise that this fiction, in many respects, actually confirms the focus he prescribes for Yiddish fiction on its own ethnic integrity, as well as its orientation not to the American present, but to the traditions of a Jewish past. And in this respect, it's worth digressing to note that Opatoshu is primarily remembered today and was primarily known in his lifetime, both in the United States and in Europe, as an author of historical fiction, novels that take place in the 19th century and the 17th century, not chronicles of his day-to-day life in New York City, although, as I mentioned, there's no shortage of that writing as well if you look for it. Now, although Opatoshu deserves credit in Lynching for his capacities of moral imagination, emotional empathy, and political indignation when confronting the most egregious human rights problem in the United States at that time, the story not only reveals the inevitable limits that particularly a talented writer encounters when trying to depict a fundamentally foreign culture, but also suggests analogous limits for representing ethnic difference within the discourse of Yiddish fiction generally. At the outset of the story, Opatoshu provides a description of an African-American character, the grandfather Jim, that reads as an unfortunate compendium of dehumanizing stereotypes. Quote, "At the threshold in the shadows sat an old Negro. His distended arms hung around his feet, and the heavy palms with outstretched fingers seemed to touch the earth. He dozed with half-shut eyes, his short, flat nose with flared nostrils, the curls on his head which extended to his eyebrows, the bare arms with shoulders covered in gray fleece, all of this resembled an aged orangutan." This unfortunate description indicates that Opatoshu resorts to the same cliches when describing an unfamiliar ethnicity that other writers of his day, better acquainted with black people and ethnic difference, recycled habitually. A more interesting literary and linguistic problem presents itself, however, when describing black characters not as an ethnic type, but as people interacting with other people. For example, when Jim greets the sheriff and his deputies at his door, he takes note of the occasion by calling them "Angelegt the guest," welcome guests, sounding more like Sholem Aleichem's Tevye the dairyman than an African-American from the Jim Crow South. By conspicuous contrast, when Bookert's mother hears the unwelcome news that he is wanted for the rape of McClure's daughter Carrie, she crosses herself silently and fervently, a gesture more characteristic of Polish Catholics than American Protestants. These two details point to a larger problem in Opatoshu's approach to portraying black people, one that ultimately resonates with other Yiddish depictions. Are African Americans as a powerless and degraded people to be likened to Jews or to Slavic peasants? Does the perspective of the description assume that they are identical to Jews or inversely other? This problem is ultimately as much linguistic as it is psychological or political. Though American discourse, and particularly African American discourse, is as rooted in the Bible as Yiddish discourse is, it is nevertheless difficult, beyond Opatoshu's rhetorical assumptions, to find equivalences between English idioms and Yiddish ones. Consider in this regard the remark of a farmer who has come with the sheriff to serve papers on Bookert at the beginning of the story. Even when you hear the last blast of the shofar, a Negro will still say Amen after the priest's sermon. Although American Protestantism shares with Jewish eschatology a concept of Gabriel's trumpet ushering in either apocalypse or redemption, Das letzte Blasen von Schäfer neither captures the southern idiom, nor does it render the image it signifies closer to a Jewish means of expression. Similarly, Dem Galach's drosha is neither a Protestant minister's sermon nor a Catholic priest's homily. By the same token, when Jim exclaims, "Wie ich bin a Christ," as sure as I'm a Christian, it fails to match either the rhetorical power or the literal meaning of "As ich bin a Yid," sure as I'm a Jew, because unlike the inextricable equation of Yiddish with Jewishness, an equivalence that Opatoshu actually resists in this passage, Christianity in America can be affirmed neither univocally nor monolingually. The problems Opatoshu encounters when imagining a black character go beyond the linguistic challenges of rendering an English language consciousness in Yiddish. They return the reader's attention to the more essential and essentializing question of how literature relates for Opatoshu to the history and traditions of a specific language and culture. When Jim inevitably associates Bookert's fate in the 20th century with his own childhood memories of slavery, the author renders his thoughts by writing, quote, "The whip flew over the skin with a whistle, eating its way into the blood, and a natal fear that maybe his ancestors experienced in the African jungles when they crawled on all fours to hide themselves so that a wild animal would not tear them to shreds. The same fear was awoken in him." Although the image of African ancestors crawling on all fours is undeniably racist, the larger comparison equates the white slave driver with wild animals, a more pointedly dehumanizing image that serves to reverse the logic of white supremacy by rendering the white racist much lower on the evolutionary scale than the black people whom he brutalizes physically and terrorizes psychologically. Because Opatoshu has inherited a discourse about black people from white racism, it can only inhabit the limits set by that discourse in its imaginative poverty. Had Opatoshu been describing Jewish suffering, by contrast, he could have, and he would have, drawn on a ready-made body of myth and legend derived from biblical narrative, folk legend, rabbinical rhetoric, and the whole history of the Jewish diaspora. Describing the travails of American black people, however, he reverts to an image of a primal, ahistorical past. The rhetorical problem of finding the language to describe black suffering bespeaks and begets a narrative problem of how to align the narrator's obvious sympathies for black characters confronting the injustice of American racism with the obligation of translating these experiences into a recognizable Yiddish idiom. This challenge is a consequence of the author's need to confront two languages simultaneously within the monolingual decorum of literary realism. The disconnection of English with Yiddish results in what might be described as what I'm calling a polytonal narrative situation, like a musical composition played in two keys at the same time. I could show you how it's done on the piano maybe during the Q&A session. Although literary modernism, particularly but not exclusively in Yiddish, often cultivates such linguistic dissonance, polytonality in a realistic discourse is as disruptive as it is in a tonal composition, because it underscores the irreparable disconnections between the social elements that the realist narrative would be expected to dramatize and thus reconcile. This artistic flaw nonetheless contributes to the story's moral value. By capturing the contradictions of American racism, Opatoshu makes of American racism an object that in turn exposes the inability to reconcile the social dissonances for the culture for a rational and national modernity. Opatoshu's failure as a realist, moreover, underscores his temporal, political, and thematic affinities with contemporaneous Yiddish modernism, like the poem that I quoted at the beginning of my remarks. Even unwittingly or unwillingly, it is perhaps the fate of the peripheral writer to approach the avant-garde, if only by virtue of his or her status between languages and cultures. Indeed, in order for a realist narrative to provide a harmonizing perspective on the various social elements through which it constitutes itself, it must focus on a central character, space, or social institution that brings coherence to the social dimension of the story it relates. Hence, the reliance of realist novels on the country boy come to the big city, on the unhappy marriage between two people from different classes or generations, the life of the stock market or the railroad, or the convergence of different classes and worldviews at a market, a parade, or a harbor. For Opatoshu, the problem of reconciling the American experience with a Yiddish perspective could perhaps understandably be negotiated by Jewish characters, particularly Yiddish-speaking immigrants. This strategy imparts on Lynching a curious dramatic structure, but one that ultimately points to the ethical essence of the story and its pertinence for a Yiddish readership. At the very middle of the narration, Opatoshu interrupts the main action of the story to present an exchange between what are apparently the only Jewish residents of the town. In schematic terms, therefore, these Jews stand midway between the story's focus on Buchert's family and the pursuit of Buchert by the lynch mob. Jews stand in the story midway between blacks and whites, yet in structural as well as linguistic terms, they are detached from both. There are three characters depicted in the story: the hardware store owner Levi, his son, and a shoemaker named Harry. Levi actively opposes Buchert's lynching and speaks to his son in Yiddish. His son replies to him in English and actively seeks to participate, if not in the torture of Buchert, at least in the celebrations that accompany the spectacle. The shoemaker, who conspicuously uses the English expression all right, an emblem in American Yiddish of assimilation and the abandonment of Jewish communal spirit, more ambiguously appears at the carnival, but doesn't take a visible role in the crime itself. As this schematic relationship suggests, the role of Yiddish serves as a moral index for the positioning of these characters, and the implications of this are manifest already in the conflict between Levi and his son, as Opatoshu writes. "You won't go. I will go. And if I say no, you won't. A Jew shouldn't get involved. And if it were my sister? Why do you have to think about what might happen? It won't happen. It won't happen. But if they'll allow a drunk like McClure to act as judge, I can assure you today they'll lynch a Negro and tomorrow a Jew." Levi's warning to his son that where blacks are lynched, Jews are similarly endangered alludes explicitly to the 1915 lynching of Leo Frank, which took place, like Lynching in Georgia, and which was the most explicit and violent anti-Semitic episode in American history. Whether or not Lynching first appeared, as has been quoted, in the year of Frank's murder, this atrocity would certainly have been on the reader's mind whenever and wherever the story appeared. Levi therefore has the advantage over his son of actual historical precedent in arguing that Jewish identification with American society lies not in cultural affinity with white people, but the political liberty guaranteed by rational social institutions to all citizens, Jews as much as the African Americans, whom Opatoshu otherwise depicts in the acquiescent rhetoric of racial inferiority pervasive in his day. Indeed, on a political level, such rhetoric actually reinforces the political case Opatoshu makes for the equal protections of the Constitution, in a historical moment when they were not only contested, but nearly eclipsed. Even African Americans, Opatoshu is arguing, as much as Jews or any other citizens, deserve their constitutional rights. As the sheriff in Lynching explains to Booker before unwittingly handing him over to the lynch mob, quote, "The law doesn't know from white or black. Under the law, all are equal." The reader, then as now, recognizes the lie of these statements. In 1923, lynching wasn't even a federal crime in the United States, and the sheriff's weakness parallels Levy's powerlessness over his own son. What transpires in the sheriff's failure to implement legal order is the ritual that Opatoshu describes at the end of the story, which demonstrates how tenuous the power of rationality and